Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by a USA Today and New York Times best-selling author of psychological thrillers, including the Jonathan Stride series and many popular standalones, including his most recent book, Break Every Rule. His books have been sold in 46 countries and translated into 23 languages. His novel Spilled Blood won the ITW Thriller Award for Best Hardcover Novel, and his novel, The Deep, Deep Snow, was a finalist for the Edgar Award. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Brian Freeman. Brian, how the heck are you doing?
I am doing great. I'm doing great. Particularly this week. Last week around this time, yeah, the wind was blowing pretty hard down in Florida, but it's a beautiful day here today.
You have written at this point, how many books have you published?
Break Every Rule was my 30th novel, so pretty exciting development this year. So number 30 in the past 20 years. It's been a busy stretch.
30th novel, and your first novel, correct me if I'm wrong, Immoral came out in 2005. So that is
Yes.
just under now 20 years. You published 30
Yeah.
books in
Yep.
20 years.
Yep.
Wow.
Next year will be the 20th anniversary of Immoral. That's kind of hard to believe.
So I remember when Immortal came out, just because it was a very, I don't know if iconic is the right word, but the cover is one where just it sticks in your brain. And I remember seeing it. I believe this was back when borders were around. I
That's
would
right.
always go. I was always go to the bookstore, walk around, and I would, I was seeing Immortal everywhere. So I imagine that was you probably got a nice advance on that because it looked like the publisher was pushing that one really, really hard. And it seemed like a big book. It was not, it won the McCavity, correct? And it was
Yes. Yeah,
nominated
it
for a
won
bunch
the
of
one.
others.
Yeah, won the McCavity finalist for the Edgar, the Dagger, the Barry, the Anthony, I think. So yeah.
And I actually have the cover here. If anybody can pull it up, again, it's it's a very unique cover.
That bright yellow cover. Yes,
Has a
exactly.
great Michael Connolly blurb on it, a page turner of the highest caliber. Now, was that on the hardcover or was that on the paperback later?
Hardcover. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Very
yeah.
nice.
It's always funny. The strange twisted path of blurbs. I was working at a law firm. Still working there at the time that we were getting Immoral ready, and the one of the people that worked for me in marketing in our Boulder office was on a nonprofit board with Michael Connolly's sister. So I asked her to see if she would ask Mike, would he take a look at the book? And he was gracious enough to do so. So
That's amazing. It's very interesting. Oftentimes, the publisher or the editor has those contacts. They will reach out to those authors, and other times it's just like you said, it's knowing people who know other people, and if you're not already in that group, oftentimes writers will go to like Thriller Fest or BoucherCon and grow those relationships from there, and then meet those authors. But other times, yeah, that's incredible.
yeah, you never know what's going to come from. I will tell you, actually, my favorite blurb story is actually a reader wrote to me a couple of years ago, and it's kind of sad now because it's a Nelson DeMille story, and I so miss
Mm.
having Nelson in this world. But he was a retired police officer. He'd been writing to me for years about how much he enjoyed my books, and he said, I don't think I've ever told you how I got to know your books. And apparently, he was a police officer in the town where Nelson DeMille lived, and they got an alarm notification at DeMille's house. And so he was not home. And the rules were, well, if you get an alarm notification, you go in, you check the house, clear it, make sure everything's okay. So there he is in Nelson DeMille's bedroom, and he sees a book on DeMille's nightstand, and it's Immoral. Uh, and he says, well, if it's good enough for Nelson DeMille, it's good enough for me. So he went and bought himself a copy, and he was reading my books ever since. So that was when DeMille was reading my stuff, and he gave me a great blurb for stock a couple books later. So I thought, oh, that's a great way to find a new reader.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crap. I mean, if you get a really big name author to blurb you, it's great. But then finding out that they're just reading you for pleasure
Yeah,
is a whole nother level.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Immoral. Well, actually, because I have the cover up here, part of the cover says, "In a moral world, murder is the ultimate crime," and of course, the book's called Immoral. Um, that's a great little. I mean, that's a great little tag. Was that something that the publisher came up with, or maybe when you were shopping it around, or like how did that come about?
That was a St. Martin's publisher thing. They came up with the look and feel for Immoral. It was such a very distinctive cover and approach, and so yeah, I loved it. They had a great tagline. They had a great cover. The only downside of that cover, boy, that yellow fades like crazy, man. That thing gets in the sun at all, and it the color just disappears.
So, all right, so that was 2005. This was your first published novel. Now, is Immoral your first published novel or your first novel?
Oh, that was actually the sixth book that I had written in my lifetime. So I still have five books sitting in my nightstand drawer. Admittedly, this goes back to when I was 13 because I wrote my first full-length novel on binder paper with Bic pen when I was 13 years old. So I still got a copy of that one. But yeah, so no, I'd been writing, my whole life, and I think there just comes a point where sort of your life experience and your craft experience reach kind of a tipping point, and everything comes together. And I think that was what happened with Immoral.
So 13 was when you wrote your first novel. I want to a while back I had Lisa Regan on, and she said I think she wrote her first book back when she was in middle school too. I mean, hers also was over like 100,000 words. So what was yours? Do you remember what you said you still have it? Do you
I
remember like
I
what was it
I
about?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it was called The Motive, which I believe John Lesquia would steal years later. I'm watching you, John. And it was about, of all things, it was about the kidnapping of the president. And I can remember there were like scenes set on ski slopes in Switzerland. I don't know what the heck that was about, but plenty of sex and violence. Perfect for a 13-year-old boy. So very very little has changed.
Feels like Brad Thor probably got an early copy of that for his first book. Maybe. I don't know. Okay, so obviously 13, you wrote your first book. That's incredible. So at that point, what was happening like were you reading certain authors or I mean, not most 13-year-olds kind of feel like, okay, I'm gonna sit down and write a book.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I was a voracious reader. I read, I read a certain amount of mysteries and thrillers. I was a huge Ludlum fan. So, I mean, the great irony of me taking over the Jason Bourne series 40 years later. I was reading Ludlum from when I was a teenager. But I actually read a lot of the kind of the big dramatic authors. I read a lot of James Michener, Irving Wallace, Leon Uris, folks like that, and I think it's one of the reasons why I tend not to write kind of typical thrillers. I like to write more emotional, dramatic thrillers because I still love the kind of the emotional sagas that I read as a kid.
So did you end up I mean, did you try to get that published or what happened with it?
Let's see. The one when I was 13, I don't think I ever had the chutzpah to sell that. I tried with all the later ones. I'd send out queries to agents and publishers, and they would come back in just pristine condition. I mean, paperclip not even moved. So I mean, you knew nobody spent 30 seconds looking at what you sent in. So I mean, it's the wonderful discouragement that forces you to see if you've got that steel inside to continue being a writer.
And for writers who are watching this now, you have to understand 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't the same where there was email, where everybody had email. You literally had to like
Manila
write out
envelopes,
query
baby.
letters
Yep.
and mail those out. And if
Yep.
they were interested, they would either call you or they would send it back and request the physical manuscript, which you would have to send because this had happened
Yes.
to. I mean,
Oh, yes.
I had got my first agent outside of college, and that was what 2004, 2005. So like literally, this was back then, and even when they were submitting it, I'm assuming this happened to you too. I had to provide like 10 separate copies of the manuscript to send my agent because
Well,
otherwise they could do it or they would take it out of, you know what I mean? Like it was
I
insane.
I can remember with my second book when they were just sort of nudging into the electronic age, and I got a request from the assistant to my editor, and she said, I need you to send me a copy of the book on CD. So I attached it to the email and sent back and said, here you go. And she wrote back and said, no, I actually need it on CD. And I was like, well, okay, now you do realize that email I sent you, that file, that's the exact same file I'm going to send you if I send you CD. Yep, that's what we need. Okay.
It's ridiculous. So, all right. So obviously you had a hit. So did you have any nibbles before with any of the other novels that you had quarried?
I had some nibbles here and there, and I got a lot of encouraging stuff from agents. Honestly, it was one of my favorite stories looking back. I mean, taking over the Bourne series, one of my great regrets in life is that I never had a chance to meet Robert Ludlum. I mean, I would have loved to have a chance to meet him, but I actually did have an interaction with Ludlum. It was probably in the early to mid '90s, and I had one of my five novels done, and I was working at a college that had a big alumni event they did every year down in Naples, Florida, and Naples is where Mr. Ludlum lived. And so I was meeting with this alum, and she happened to mention to me that she lived in right across from the condo tower where Robert Ludlum lived, and she was commenting on the fact that she'd wake up sometimes at 4 in the morning, and the entire floor where Ludlum lived was lit up because that's when he did his writing. And of course, being the entrepreneur that I was, I figured out what the address of the condo tower was, and I sent Ludlum off a letter and just said, would you read my book? And I got a lovely note back from him a couple weeks later, and apologizing and saying, he can't really read unpublished material, but he's forwarded, my letter on to his agent in New York and asked him to take a look at my stuff. And so I sent it off to Ludlum's agent. I got a very nice note back from him, basically saying, I don't think this is quite ready, but you've got a lot of talent, and I hope you keep at it, and I hope you keep trying. So that was such a great shot in the arm for me, and I look back, and I hope Robert Ludlum is looking down and saying, "Oh, that was that guy. He wrote to me, and he ended up taking over the Bourne series."
Do you still have that letter?
Boy, I'd have to look and see. I bet somewhere I've got it, but the hard part was when we moved from Minnesota to Florida, a lot of old stuff went, so I'm not sure what's still in my files and what's not.
I mean, I feel like that's a frameable piece,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
all right, so you wrote Immoral. That was the one that got the interest from the agent. They shopped it around. Um, was it St. Martin's Press
Yes.
published this?
Minotaur, yeah.
Minotaur. Okay.
Yeah.
Was it just them? Did they put an offer or did it go to auction?
Well, I'm trying to remember now. I think they were first out of the block, and we said, yeah, let's go for it. So
Because, like I said, I mean, it was everywhere, and I think I
yeah,
mentioned too that Michael Connolly had the blurb on the front. I don't know if I read it
yes,
there. A page turner of the highest caliber. I mean, come on.
yeah, that
That's
was pretty cool. And we got a blurb from Jeffrey Deaver, and I mean, it was just and yeah, it was great.
so. This is your Jonathan. This is your book one in the Jonathan Stride series. Prior
Yes,
to that, had any of the other books featured Jonathan Stride, or and
they
if
they
not, how
hadn't.
did?
Yeah, they hadn't, but the last project I worked on before I wrote Immoral was kind of a long mystery novella, and I went back and read that a few years ago because I hadn't really thought about it in ages. And the hero of that mystery was a guy from Duluth named Daniel Barrett, and it was funny reading the novella, and it was so clear that Daniel Barrett was a creative antecedent to Stride, and you could see that all of the kind of the elements of Stride were there in him that would kind of come to full fruition a few years later when I wrote Immoral.
And was this initially just going to be a standalone, or did you have the idea that okay, this is a character I'm going to be able to go for another two, three, four more
Yeah, I
books?
never I never thought of it as a series. I really thought of Immortal as a standalone, and I was assuming that that's the direction I was going to go. And we Immoral was selected as an international book of the month by Bookspan, which at the time they owned book clubs all over the world. And so all these publishers in different countries were sort of immediately writing and saying, well, are we going to get another Jonathan Stride novel? And St. Martin's and Headline in the UK were saying the same thing. It's like, oh well, I guess I'm writing a series here. So I had in mind kind of a plot for a second book set in Las Vegas, and which I again intended to be kind of a standalone. But as I thought about where Immoral stood, I realized that this actually was sort of a natural flow for Stride and Serena out of Immoral, and so that was where Stripped came from.
And how many books right now are in the Stride series?
There's 11 books in the Stride series, plus a Stride short story and a Stride novella that were sort of ebook exclusives.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. I mean, most series don't go more than like two books, two or three
Well,
books. So
yeah, and it's hard because the farther you go into a series, the harder it is to get new readers because you know, readers, I mean, as much as I tell them until I'm blue in the face that I write every series book so that you can dive in anywhere, you can get a full, rich understanding of the characters, even if you're reading book 8 or 9 or 10 or 11. There are a lot of folks that if it's a series, they want to go back to book one and read their way forward, which is great. But you get to 11 books in a series, and that's a big ask for new readers.
oh, absolutely. So, what was your first standalone after you had started? So, Immoral came out. I'm assuming it was a big splash. You said it was
Mm-hmm.
book clubs all over the world and wanted to
Yeah,
publish
yeah.
it. I mean, well, what were you doing before you published Immoral? You had mentioned before you were doing some different thing. Like, what was your main day job?
I was, of all things, I was director of marketing and public relations at a corporate law firm in Minneapolis, which every bit as glamorous as it sounds.
Right. But I mean, like we all know, Patterson started out in like ads. So like, do you feel
Right,
that the
absolutely.
marketing really kind of helped you then coming into being a published author?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, sure. I mean, certainly it ended up being a lot more fun doing marketing and PR for my own stuff as opposed to, for another entity. But honestly, I think what was really valuable about working at the law firm was I learned a lot about storytelling from the lawyers. I mean, I can remember talking to the litigators, and their attitude was basically the lawyer that tells the best story to the jury is the one who wins. And so I really learned about how they think about how they craft a story, often on very complicated topics, for the jury. And so there have been a lot of lessons I've been able to put into play throughout my career since then.
And so, what kind of schedule were you doing? Obviously, you had the day job. So, were you trying to write every night or in the morning before you went to work, or just trying to fit it in wherever you could?
Yeah, Immoral. I mean, it probably took me 4 or 5 years to write Immoral, and I would write in the evenings and in hotel rooms and on buses and in planes, and so it was I kind of pick it up and put it down. Um, when we sold Immoral, they were two book deals, so I was obligated then for a second book, which became Stripped. And so we'd sold Immoral in a bunch of different countries, but no books had actually come out. I stayed at the law firm until early 2005, and so about a year after everything kind of got rolling. And I talked with my wife about it and said, I mean, if I keep working at the law firm simultaneously with writing the book, I feel like I'm going to be a mediocre marketing director and a mediocre novelist. I said, if there's one time in our lives that I think it's worth taking the risk, I think this is it. And I said, let's give it a few years and see if it works, and if not, I'll go back and do PR and sign on with an agency or something. And so I quit my day job. My first day of self-employment was April 1st, 2005. I thought April 1st was a suitably appropriate day to try self-employment, and so that helped. So most of the time after selling Immoral throughout the rest of that year, most of what I was doing was the editorial work on Immoral, and I was fitting that around my job at the law firm. And I really started cranking on Stripped after I left Faegre. So.
And so, obviously, nowadays, actually, I want to go back to the production schedule for Immoral because we had mentioned before, obviously, things have really changed. Nowadays, the editing process typically is you get a copy edited Word doc where there's like, track changes. You just go through the manuscript, accept, reject, answer questions and comments, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Back then, though, was this all old school paper where they were actually sending you the manuscript and you were
Oh yeah.
going back and forth that way?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I can remember. I can't remember if it was stripped or stalked, but they sent me the hard copy page proofs to go through, and I started going through them, and I was finding these typos, and I was like, okay, there's just no way I could possibly have missed this. I mean, I pride myself in turning in a absolutely clean manuscript, and I'm seeing typos in the book. I'm thinking, how could I possibly have turned it in and not seen that? Well, I went back to my Word document and discovered that I hadn't missed it. They had gone and retyped the entire manuscript in order to do the typeset version of it. They hadn't used the electronic version. They retyped it. I'm like, oh my God, which meant, of course, that I had to, I literally had to reread word for word the entire manuscript again to proof it because it was all different.
Yeah, these youngins don't understand
I know
how
things have
the
changed
Wild
a
West
lot.
days of publishing. I mean, that doesn't necessarily say that there aren't still issues, and
Oh,
like
of
screw
course.
ups from
Absolutely.
publishers. But
Absolutely.
yes, there's been some. I would say almost every writer I know has had some type of horror story that either they catch it right before publication or it comes out, and then
Oh yeah,
there's
and there's
pages
always
missing or
oh yeah, or
stuff
something.
like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, there's always some annoying little error that I mean, it doesn't matter how many readers and proofreaders and copy editors, something slips through, and but nothing gets past the readers. They catch it immediately. So.
So, all right. So Moral came out. You're now doing this full time. How did your what did your writing schedule become? Were you trying to write every day? Oh, well, I guess before we talk about that, are you somebody who does outline or you just kind of go off the cuff, or is it kind of maybe a mixture of both?
It has evolved a lot over the years. In my early books, I wrote pretty detailed outlines. I would say I did that for probably the first 8 to 10 novels. I'd write really extensive chapter by chapter outlines, background character sketches, and I think it was helpful because even though I'd written multiple books in my life before breaking through, so the idea of finishing a novel wasn't intimidating to me. I think it was a useful kind of emotional crutch to be able to like, okay, I know what I'm doing here. I know where the story is going, so I've got this blueprint that I can use to help me through the book. But the longer I was at it, the more I realized that I didn't actually like being quite that tied down. So I still typically know the backstory of the book. So I kind of know the secrets of who did what to whom and why. But my outlines are a lot less detailed now. They're more sort of just rough road maps of kind of how I want to get from the beginning to the end, allowing me to really let the story and the characters evolve as I'm getting the words on the page. So I can really feel the suspense as I'm telling the story and figure out where what I thought was going to work isn't going to work, and I switch things around. And so I usually I kind of have a sense of what I want to do in a chapter and sort of the rough blocking of what's going to happen, but all the details I kind of figure out then on the fly on that day.
How long is it like a page long, 2 pages long? I mean, typically, how long is kind of this rough idea per book? Do you?
Oh, probably 5 or 6 pages, I guess. And
Okay.
it used to be, probably 20 to 30. So
Oh, wow. All right. So you mentioned before, we're coming up on basically 20 years since your first published novel. You have just published your 30th book, which means you've been busy. So
yeah.
typically, I mean, you're getting, I guess, for a while there, at least 2 books a year. I know I think in the green room you said it's been 3 books a year now for the past couple years. Um, so you're just writing every day?
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much. I for my first at least 10 years, I was only doing a book a year. I look back on those days now and I'm thinking, what the hell was I doing? Man, that must have felt like a vacation. I mean, and I assure you, it did not feel like a vacation, but yeah, now the idea of doing one book a year kind of feels like dialing it back. But the good thing is I've been doing it long enough that I have a process that works for me, and so I know kind of how I need to approach the manuscript and what deadlines and expectations I have to set in the short run and the long run for where I am in the book. So I always have a pretty good sense of where I am, and so and the hardest year I had was a year. The first time I had to write 3 books in a year, and it was I'd written one and it was done. And then early June, I had to be writing the next Jonathan Stride novel, which I believe was I was either Alter Ego or Funeral for a Friend. I can't remember which one. And my first Jason Bourne novel, The Bourne Evolution, which was a really stressful thing. And so the deadlines were both toward the end of December, within 2 weeks of each other. I'm like, oh God, how the hell am I going to make this work? So I ended up having to basically go back and forth between the Stride novel and the Bourne Evolution week by week for 6 months. So I'd spend a week on Bourne and then a week on Stride, and I'd trade off. And there were a lot of days where I was doing that 6 or 7 days a week. And it worked. I mean, it worked great. I was thrilled with both of the books, but I never want to do that again. I really much prefer writing successively, where I can finish off one project and then move on to the next one. But when it's 3 a year, that's hard. So right now, this year, I've been writing 2 Bourne novels and a new standalone mystery for Blackstone, and so I've had to kind of do a little bit of back and forth. So I would take maybe a month to 6 weeks on my Blackstone mystery, and then go back to Bourne, and then kind of work through the rewrites and edits for my own editorial work in the middle of that as well. So yeah, it's I can make it work, but it's certainly not my preference. That's a lot of creative production, and it just stresses you out. I mean, because you feel like you have to be creative every day, and you can't wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I just don't feel like writing today. It's like, well, that's the way it goes. You gotta sit down and stare at the screen.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was Harlan Coben or Lee Child or somebody who would always say that, plumbers don't wake up and decide, oh, I don't want to plumb today. It's like, no, this is your job. This is what you, this is what you have to do. So you just do
Right.
it. So, and I think a lot of writers don't really understand essentially when you say writing 3 books a year, obviously that is a lot because what these clock in at like 100,000 words each
Yeah,
or
just about 100,000. Yeah, yeah.
so it's not just writing that draft each. You also then are also going through the editorial, the copy edits for like each
Yes,
book, and I mean you have to fit
exactly.
all of that in. And so I'm sure that
Yeah.
is.
Plus book launches from the previous years. So yeah, yeah, exactly.
So do you ever then take time off, like even a week here or there?
Not much. We finally got away for a nice vacation in May of this year. That was the first real vacation that we've taken since 2022. And so yeah, and I turned in the completed draft of my new mystery to Blackstone yesterday, and today I'm back in on Bourne. So I wrote 2,000 words on the new Bourne today. So yeah, there's not a lot of time to just kind of relax and say, "Oh, job well done." You pretty well just got to keep diving in. So
Yeah, so we're going to talk about Bourne in a little bit.
yep.
Before that, though, with the Stride books, how many Stride books did you do before you wrote and published your first standalone?
There were 5 Stride novels. I did Immoral, Stripped, Stalked, In the Dark, and The Burying Place. So the first 5 books were all Stride novels. And then I decided to do something a little different, and I wrote a standalone novel called The Bone House, which was based partly in Florida and then mostly in Door County over in Wisconsin, and introduced a detective named Cab Bolton from Florida. And that one started out as a pure standalone. Then I actually ended up writing a follow-up Cab Bolton novel a few years later called Season of Fear. So it was sort of a mini series that went along with that. And then after The Bone House, that was when I wrote Spilled Blood, which was the one that won the Thriller Awards. So I wrote two standalones, and then I went back to Stride with The Cold Nowhere, and I wrote then several more Strides in a row. So
Was there any trepidation from the publisher when all of a sudden you were right, you had 5 Stride books, then you decide, oh, I want to try something else, which again, I think diversifying is good. I interviewed Tess Gerritsen, I think earlier this year, and she had said the longevity, because just like yourself, I mean, you're coming up on 20 years, 30 books, still going strong. I think it's part of that probably that diversity of, you're not just sticking with just the one series, you're doing different series,
yeah.
you're doing standalones. But sometimes publishers don't like that. I mean, well, what kind of conversation was that with your agent or editor, or, like how did that decision come about where you're like, okay, I'm going to try something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple things involved with that. One is that I think that reader tastes tend to kind of come and go in waves over the course of 5 to 10 years, and I think when I started out, we were very much in a series market in the book biz, and series were the things that sold. And I think then you started to see that shifting. I think, frankly, as Amazon began to have kind of more of a role in the retail side of things, I think it oddly ended up starting to shift things into more of a standalone market where each new book is a new bite at the apple. And so I think publishers were seeing that trend shift. So the idea of doing something different and trying a standalone, I think they actually liked the idea of that. And so for me, the diversity of what I've been able to do, that's really been the most fun I've had. I mean, I love the idea that I've been able to do so many really, really different projects. I mean, I've got, my Stride series, which is kind of this gritty, police procedural series. I've got some really interesting out there standalones like Infinite and I Remember You that almost kind of graze a little bit on the edge of sci-fi. Obviously, I've got the action thrillers with Bourne and then several very emotional psychological mysteries with female first person narration, like the Deep Deep Snow and the Ursulina and Thief River Falls. So that's really that's what keeps me energized. I love the idea that from book to book, I can tell very different stories and bring very different characters to readers, which is probably the last thing I should be doing from a marketing standpoint, because it makes it very hard to define what your brand is from readers. They don't necessarily know what they're going to be getting from you, and I always tell folks, well, I want to be kind of the Tom Hanks of the publishing world. Tom Hanks, you have no idea what role he's going to do next. They're all going to be wildly different. But if you see his name on the marquee, you're like, okay, you know what? I bet I'm going to like that movie. And I want readers to think of my books the same way. You might not know what I'm going to do next, but if you see my name on the cover, I hope you're going to find that it's a great story.
It's good. I like that. But now you have though written a few things under different names. So tell us about Allie O'Brien. How'd that come about?
Yeah, this was pretty early on in my career. I think it was 2008, 2009. And I was my primary literary agent at that point was actually based in London. Allie Gunn was when I signed on with her, she was with the Curtis Brown agency in London, and she was my primary agent for my first 10 years in the business. And Allie was just a force of nature. I mean, just such an amazing woman, and just a wonderful, raucous, rowdy sense of humor. And she had always wanted to do a novel set in the publishing industry. But Allie wasn't a writer, and so we'd become really good friends. And she said, would you be interested in teaming up with me to kind of create a book that kind of satirizes the world of publishing and agenting? And it sounded like a lot of fun to me. And so we sat down, and I kind of mapped out what we could do, and I based the character of Tess Drake so heavily on Allie and her experiences in the agenting and publishing world, and that was where the agency came from. And it was nothing like any of my mysteries or thrillers, and we kind of had fun with the pseudonym Allie for Allie Gunn and O'Brien for Brian Freeman, and we kind of kept it a mystery in the publishing world. We didn't admit who had actually written it for a while, but we had a great run with it. I think we sold it in 10 or 11 countries. It was reviewed in People magazine. It was just a fun project to work on, something so totally different. And the only sad outcome of that was just a couple of years later, my lovely agent Allie passed away very unexpectedly, 45 years old, and she
Oh, wow.
she died of a cerebral hemorrhage in her sleep. And I'd been bouncing around a lot of different ideas for a follow-up novel to the agency, and I had to decide, did I even want to do it without Allie in my life anymore? And I ultimately wrote a book called West 57. And I self-published it under the name B.N. Freeman. And It is clearly a follow-up novel to The Agency, but I kind of changed the names around because Allie wasn't involved this time. And again, fun book to write. I love doing it. There was just sort of this little overlay of sadness because when I think back to The Agency, I smile and I laugh, but I also get a little bit of a tear because it makes me think of losing Allie so unexpectedly.
So when she was was she the agent then on that
She
project?
was, yeah.
So when she was shopping that around, was she then not telling anyone that she was actually the author?
Nope. Yeah. Nope. She didn't.
Wow,
Yeah. So yeah. My
that's
agent,
hilarious.
my agent Deborah in New York was my U.S. agent. She became my primary agent after Allie passed away, and so she was doing the U.S. sale, and it was fun because everybody was like, well, who's behind this? Who actually wrote this?
Wow. All right, great. All right. So it looks like here was it 2000, I believe on your website you said 2019 was when was that when you were picked to be
Uh,
taking over the
yeah, it
Bourne or like,
was. Yeah, it first came up in toward the end of 2018. I got a call from Deborah, and she told me that Putnam had acquired the rights to the Jason Bourne series, and they were looking for a new writer to take over the franchise. And she's like, do you want to toss your hat in the ring? And I mean, I'd been a huge Ludlum fan growing up. The Bourne Identity, one of my all-time favorite novels. So I said, yeah, let's go after it. Let's see what happens. And I guess probably about 4 months went by, just dead silence. Didn't hear a word. And I was actually getting ready for a book event up in Duluth, and I was at lunch with my wife, and I got another call from Deborah, and she said 5 words that will linger in my head for a long time. Putnam wants you for Bourne. And my first reaction was, oh my God, and my second reaction was, oh my God. It was a really intimidating thought to, step into the shoes of a giant like Ludlum, and particularly, an iconic franchise like Jason Bourne. But I called Tom Colgan over at Putnam, and he said, I've been reading your stuff, and I think you'd be a great fit for the Bourne series. What do you want to do with it? What do you want to do with Bourne? And so I said, there have been so many iterations of Bourne over the past 40 years, from the original 3 Ludlum novels through all of the great Matt Damon movies, and Eric von Lustbader taking over then and writing, I think it was 11 more Bourne novels. And there was even an NBC miniseries in the late 80s with Richard Chamberlain as Jason Bourne, and Jacqueline Smith of Charlie's Angels fame as Marie St. Jacques. So I said, there have been so many different visions of Bourne. I don't think you can build on what's come before. I said, what I want to do is take Ludlum's character from the Bourne Identity and lift up that character and recreate him very authentically, and really be true to Ludlum's character, but drop him down into modern settings, all new stories, all new supporting characters. So essentially, it's a complete reboot of the series. Tom loved that idea. He ran it by the estate. The estate loved that idea, and so that's what we did. The Bourne Evolution was my first Bourne book. We now have 5 Bourne books that I've released, with the 6th coming in January. And again, it's a complete re-envisioning of the whole series.
now these, as you mentioned before, are more action adventure. But prior, had your books were more, I guess, mystery? Or I mean, what do you think it was that Putnam saw in your previous books? Or you mentioned Tom, the editor, that they
Yeah.
saw that they felt like, okay, he can handle the action adventure too.
Yeah, that was really an interesting thing, because that was honestly, that was my first reaction too, is that I love the idea of the challenge. I thought I could do great things with it. But they were definitely not the kind of books I'd written. I mean, my stuff was much more psychological mysteries and police procedurals and things like that. So kind of more pure action was definitely a new genre for me. But I think what worked was the fact that I try to write mysteries and thrillers that are very character driven, and I think what is distinctive about Bourne as a hero is he's a very complex psychological character, from losing his memory and beginning to kind of he's got this ongoing quest to sort of figure out who he is, not just from a standpoint of his past, but sort of trying to understand who he is as a moral and ethical human being, and what kind of a person is he. And I think that's what makes him such an interesting psychological hero. So I think that for me was really the fit, is that I love creating thriller heroes with a lot of psychological depth. And so I think that was kind of what matched me up with Bourne.
And so you mentioned about rebooting like the entire series in more modern day. Did you feel compelled to take aspects of like the original trilogy, like obviously I guess there's Treadstone, but what about like Carlos or like different characters? Like how I don't know, like in terms of the rebooting, how much are you doing just completely fresh stuff? Or are you taking kind of what's old and trying to make it new?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to really get a lot of the old stuff in there, because clearly it was a completely different era. I mean, the Bourne Identity came out in 1980, emerged out of the whole Vietnam and Watergate era. So unless you're thinking that Liam Neeson's going to replace Matt Damon in the movies, you really don't want a 70-year-old action hero in your books. So I what I wanted to do was kind of pay tribute to Ludlum. And so if you read the Bourne Evolution, I think you'll see that Bourne Evolution is very much an homage to the Bourne Identity. And I was deliberately creating a plot that had echoes of what Ludlum did with the Bourne Identity. So Abby Laurent is a very similar kind of character to Marie St. Jacques. And the way they come together is parallels some of the things that happen in the Bourne Identity. And I put in sort of a lot of Easter eggs from the Bourne Identity throughout the novel as well. So as a result, I think the Bourne Evolution kind of flowed very readily, but I got to the Bourne Treachery, which was the second book, and I noticed that it was coming a lot more slowly for you. It seemed to be a lot harder writing the second novel. And I realized that I kind of needed to give myself permission to take ownership of the series. That Jason Bourne was no longer just a Robert Ludlum character, but he was a Robert Ludlum Brian Freeman character. And so that kind of helped me realize that, all right, I can really own this series and let Jason Bourne evolve and grow and change based on what's happening in my books. But what I've tried to do is have sort of elements of the Ludlum series make their way into my book. So for example, the Bourne Identity revolves so much around the hunt for Carlos. And of course, it wouldn't make sense to have Carlos come back already in prison. Again, he's in his 70s. I can't remember even if Sanchez has actually passed away at this point. But so I created the character of Lenin, the Russian assassin in the Bourne Treachery. And because again, I wanted to kind of pay homage to this idea of this tete-a-tete between Bourne and an assassin. And so I built this character Lenin, inspired by the idea of Bourne doing battle with Carlos in the Bourne Identity. Bourne Sacrifice, I went back to one of my other favorite Ludlum novels, which was the Chancellor manuscript, which I almost like the Chancellor. It's heresy to say I almost like the Chancellor manuscript better than the Bourne Identity. It was my first Ludlum. I absolutely loved the book. And so I approached Putnam and the estate to ask, would it be okay if I brought Peter Chancellor from the Chancellor manuscript into the Bourne Sacrifice as a character and made him part of the plot? And I was a little worried that from an intellectual property standpoint, they might have some legal issues with that, but they thought it was great. They gave me the green light. So I was able to bring Peter Chancellor from another Ludlum book into the Bourne Sacrifice. So that's the kind of thing that I like to do to kind of keep the original Ludlum Bourne series and the Ludlum books generally kind of alive and fresh in my series.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that answers my question. I guess that's kind of what I was asking. Not necessarily you were taking Carlos or these characters, but basically
Sure.
that same idea of what you were saying and kind of the homage type aspect of it. So
Yeah. Well,
I was
plus I will say, I mean, if you look back at the era of the 1970s when Ludlum was creating Bourne, I mean, it was an era driven by distrusted government and conspiracies and this fundamental concern about where the country is going. you look at where things are today and you go, yeah, this is actually seems kind of like the perfect time to have Bourne come back to life, because everything going on in the world today kind of fits with that same milieu that Ludlum was writing in. So there's always a lot of great source material out there.
This is true. So not that long ago, I was chatting with Simon Gervais, and he had done one Ludlum
The
title, and
the
I had
Blackbriar,
asked
yep.
him. Um, well, I guess kind of the same question. Did you feel compelled at all to try to match his style? Because my understanding is essentially they want you to come in. They don't really want you to change it. They want you to write a Brian Freeman novel
Yeah.
set in that world. So like your writing style would not change, but in the back of your mind, was there still kind of that feeling like, I kind of want this to kind of feel more Ludlum, or like what was that
Yeah,
process like?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's particularly an interesting challenge with Ludlum because he had such a very unique style. It was very propulsive, very dramatic, very breathless. He always used to get kidded by critics about his use of italics and exclamation points and things. In fact, I think it was either Time or Newsweek reviewed one of Ludlum books in the Ludlum style with lots of exclamation points and italics throughout the review. So I think if you tried to emulate that style or imitate that style, it would feel like a caricature. I don't think it would work. So what I've tried to do is write in my own style, but let kind of the drama and the style of Ludlum sort of just have a little bit of an echo in my work, and let it kind of creep its way in at the edges. So I think what you end up with is a bit of a hybrid. It's not just a pure Brian Freeman novel. It's not a Robert Ludlum novel. It's kind of this melange of the two, where you can kind of feel the ghost of Ludlum on the pages, and yet at the same time, the primary style. I'm not trying to imitate it. I'm writing my own style, but letting Ludlum kind of flow through on the pages as well.
Yeah. So the Deep Deep Snow, that was a finalist for the Edgar Award, if I remember correctly, as a paperback original, because
Yes,
initially it was an Audible original.
yes, that's right.
How did that come about where you decided, this is a book that I'm going to just have released initially as audio?
Well, I kind of made a business decision, about 10 years ago that I wanted to really diversify my footprint in the publishing industry. And I felt like the days of, sticking with one author or one publisher, throughout your career was not a viable path. Over the course of time, inevitably, your relationships will evolve and change. The industry will evolve and change. The success of individual publishers will rise and fall. I didn't want to have all my eggs in one basket. So I wanted to build broader relationships in the industry. And so I talked to my agent, Deborah, about looking for other opportunities. And it was around that time that Audible was really expanding into the concept of Audible originals, and they were hungry for content. And an idea for a mystery that I'd been kind of banging around in my head for 2 or 3 years, and I hadn't kind of found the right venue for it. And when Deborah talked to me about the possibility of doing an Audible original, I thought that's just the right home for this mystery, because I wanted to do it in a female first person narration, and I thought that the first person narration would fit so beautifully with Audible, because essentially it would be the narrator telling the story directly to the reader. And so that was how it all came about. And it was a fascinating creative project for me, because it was very different writing direct to audio, because I was listening to the book as I was writing and editing out loud. And even though I've only done a couple Audible originals since then, even though everything's in audio, I still kind of find myself writing in the same way, where I'm writing and editing out loud. It was a really productive experience.
So you weren't doing that prior, like sometimes just reading the work out loud as you were going through like edits?
Yeah, not that much. No, I mean it really took shape with the Deep Deep Snow.
Interesting. So, so the Deep Deep Snow comes out from Audible Original, and if I remember correctly, because I have a weird memory for these types of things, that was a New York Times bestseller.
Correct. Yep.
Incredible. Very nice. They must have sold a shitload of audiobooks.
They sure did. We had such an amazing run with the Deep Deep Snow, and I will tell you, over the years, readers have asked me, what's your favorite book, and I always struggle with that because I love all my books for different reasons, and it kind of feels like picking your favorite child. But boy, when I wrote the Deep Deep Snow, and then the follow up book to the Deep Deep Snow was the Ursulina, I kind of see those two books as one long creative project. Uh, those two books are my favorite of anything I've done. I'm so proud of those two novels, and they have me in tears every time I read them again or listen to them again. They're very emotional mysteries, and it's a strange sensation because you always want you want each book to be your best book yet, and that's always what I'm going for. But it changes how you look at yourself when you release a book like that, because for me, it doesn't matter what else I do in this world. I will always look back on my career and say, anything else I do, great, but I wrote the Deep Deep Snow. I wrote the Ursulina. That is very special to me.
So your most recent book, let's get into that. It's
Yeah.
There Behind You, Break Every Rule, just
Yes,
recently
indeed.
came out from Blackstone. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Break Every Rule was I really wanted to write a book that combined kind of the best elements of my Jonathan Stride police procedural series and the elements of Jason Bourne. And so I deliberately was looking to create a book that kind of brought those two genres together. And so the character of Tommy Miller is on one hand it's a great action thriller. It's very Bourne-esque in that regard, and yet at the same time it shares a lot with the kind of approach I take in the Stride series, which is most of the Stride books I think you find to be novels of redemption. And when Tommy Miller is looking for his wife and daughter who have been kidnapped, he realizes that he and his wife have been keeping secrets from each other, and they haven't been honest with each other about their past and the things that brought them to that moment in life. And it was keeping those secrets that has put them both in jeopardy. And so it's a process of learning that they need to trust each other in order to sort of survive this whole experience and move forward. So on one level, again, it's this Bourne style action thriller, and on the other style, it's also a very emotional story of a husband and wife. So and I love that. I mean, I always like to write thrillers that have that emotional core.
How how many ideas do you currently have for, I mean, how far ahead are you right now in terms of books that you're planning on writing? Because you've been writing like three a year. I mean, obviously the Bourne ones are kind of set in because
Sure.
they're going to be Jason Bourne books, but
Yeah.
how, the other books, your standalones, or if you went back to Stride, I mean, like how, like how many ideas do you have right now? Do you think you could kind of keep going?
Yeah, it honestly, it's the hardest part is always choosing what are you going to do next. And it's there are creative decisions to make, there are business decisions to make. You have to think about where the publishing market is and where readers are, and it's all those factors that kind of come into play. I mean, I love the Stride novels. I'd love to write another Stride novel, but I also have to factor in, I've got 11 books in the Stride series. You get a series that long, that's a hard marketing sell because of the fact, as we were talking about, that it's hard to bring in new readers if they feel like they've got to read through 11 books to get to where you are. Even if you tell them you don't have to do that, there's still sort of that inherent reluctance. And I've got a lot of different standalone ideas, very very different approaches. So yeah, to me the challenge really is kind of figuring out where do I want to go next, and so that's usually what I kind of have a conversation with my publisher, and I'll normally kind of go to the publisher and say, here, I've got 4 or 5 different ideas here, kind of different directions I'm thinking about. What do you guys think? What does your team feel is kind of the right book for the market at the right time, and that's how we kind of try to hone in on what to do next.
So with 30 books, obviously we're not going to include the Bourne books in this. What's your ratio of your titles staying what you initially had them titled versus what the publisher ends up making them?
That's such a great author's question. Only an author would ask that, and it's dead on. I think in the first, I think in the first 10 or 11 books, maybe two had the same title as I started with. I think The Burying
Wow.
Place had the same title all the way through. I maybe The Bone House. I don't know if that was true. All the others changed.
So
But
what about what was Immoral initially called?
Immoral was originally called Rachel's Body,
Okay.
and
Yeah, they made the right choice, I think.
I see. Yeah, I mean, we sold it in 17 languages, and publishers around the world were united in two things. They loved the book, and the title was not going to be Rachel's Body. Uh, I did have a little bit of justice on my second book though, because the original title of my second book was Vegas Baby, and then we came up with Stripped as the follow up to Immoral. But at least two or three countries published it as Vegas Baby, so I was like, okay,
Mm.
all right, well, I still got that out there. But somewhere around book 8, 9, it started to change, and more of my titles started sticking all the way through, and I think now, boy, I would say the last 15 novels, I think all the titles have not changed. So I don't know if
Would
I'm
you
getting better at titles or whether the publishers are simply giving me a little bit more room to run, but most of the titles now stay the same.
I mean, do you think that part of maybe has to do with your marketing background? That now you've been doing this long enough, you know the market,
Yeah, it could
going
be.
into the
Yeah.
to the book, you kind of have the idea of like, okay, this is what's going to be a really good marketable title.
There could be some of that, sure. And I'm one of those authors. I mean, there are authors I know that they can write a book without a title. I mean, they'll put brackets on the title page and go from there. And that just would never work for me. I got to have a working title on page one. If I don't, I just can't start. It doesn't work for me. So
I have an Audible original coming out next year, and we had
oh,
a
fantastic.
title, and they wanted to come up with some alt titles in
Okay,
case the title did not get cleared. And
okay.
so my alt titles, I purposely basically came up with some really shitty alt titles, hoping that they would just keep the one, which they ended up keeping, which I was happy with. Because I was like, I don't know what I mean, this is what it should be called. This is the title. Like
Yeah,
um
yeah.
so just real quick. So in terms of writing, do you try to get in so many words a day, especially when you're writing 2 to 3 books a year? Is there like a chapter? I mean, what do you kind of feel is a satisfying writing day for you?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I try to write about 2,000 words or about one chapter every day, and I recognize that that's kind of a goal that will evolve as the manuscript goes on, because the first third of each new book is always the hardest thing to write because you're setting up the story and you're setting up the characters. So inevitably, the first third of the book goes more slowly, and then the pace tends to pick up as I get further on into the book and I have kind of more command over where the story is. But generally speaking, I'm always looking to write about 8 to 10,000 words a week. Some weeks that works. Sometimes it's less. Sometimes it's more. But that's kind of where I usually try to set my goal.
And is this? And I'm sorry, you may have mentioned this. I think I blanked out for a second. Do you try to write every day, or do you take like a Saturday or Sunday off?
Yeah, I was in the traditional workforce for so long that I kind of still see writing as the Monday to Friday job. So I still think of it as that's my job. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
the
and
way I
as
think of it.
Walter Mosley says, as long as you're thinking about writing, that's still writing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like the story goes away, even if you're not, actually sitting at the keyboard. I mean, it's flowing through your head anyway. So
Yeah, I've always found that. I mean, now when I mow, I'll put on earphones because I have like an electric mower, so I can do that and listen to an audiobook. But for the longest time, it was just just the loud noise. I would just always be thinking about the story or whatever I was currently working on or what I wanted to work on next. Just kind of that idea of just because most times, I mean, you're in the car, you're listening to music, you're listening to audiobook, podcast, you're at the grocery store, you probably have headphones or earpods in. Just trying to, I guess, yeah, having that kind of that quiet time where you're just focusing just on the story is always
right.
nice.
Yep. Yep. No, exactly.
So, so you said that how many Stride novels have there been?
There have been 11 full-length novels plus a stride short story and a stride novella that were sort of exclusives.
Do you do you kind of have an end game in mind so far with this character, or you
I
feel that you could just kind of keep going forever?
Yeah, I don't, because I want, with a series book, I think it's important for the character to keep growing and changing based on what's happened in the series. So I never like to think too far ahead with a series character like Stride, because what happens in the book I'm working on will affect what's going to happen in the next book in the series. And in fact, when I'm working on a series book like Stride, I don't start by thinking about the plot. I start by analyzing the characters and figuring out where they are emotionally and psychologically in their lives and what's going on and what do they need to deal with. And then I tend to write a plot that forces them to confront those issues in their life. So the character, where the characters are in the story, end up kind of reinforcing each other and going hand in hand. So as a result, I can't really think too far ahead because I don't necessarily know how that's all going to evolve as the characters change. So for a series, I tend to take it a book at a time.
Yeah. Okay. Any little sneak peek of what we can expect next year out of your 2 or 3 books that you're publishing?
Yeah, it'll be another busy year. My sixth Bourne book, The Bourne Vendetta, is already on the slate. That'll be out January 14th. I just turned in a new standalone mystery, female first-person narration like The Deep, Deep Snow. It's called Photograph, and Blackstone will be releasing that probably September or October of next year. And I'm working on my seventh Bourne novel, The Bourne Escape, right now, and so I would expect that would be a summer release from Putnam.
Very cool. And so, Brian, where can people find you online if they wanna look you up?
Yeah, absolutely. They can find me on the web at bfreemanbooks.com, all one word. That's bfreemanbooks.com. They'll find descriptions and sales links and everything about all 30 books out there. And then they can find me anywhere on social media. They can look me up on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram. Just look for B Freeman Books, and they will find me out there.
All right, excellent. Oh, I wanted to ask you real quick. So you mentioned before, obviously, as writers, we grow, we change. Ideally, we become better writers, with each new book. Is
Yep.
there something that you wish you would have known, very early in your career in terms of maybe writing, publishing, or anything that you kind of feel like, damn, I probably could have be, my career could be so much farther if I knew, one particular thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a strange thing to say all this time in after 11 books in the Stride series. I love Stride as a character. I hope I have a chance to do more Stride books going forward, but I don't know that I would have done series books if I had to do it all over again. I think I probably would have stayed with standalones because I think the marketing complexity of series books is very different and difficult. And the good thing about standalones is you kind of have a new bite at the apple every time. You have a new bite at bringing readers in and inviting them to the table. You have a new bite at selling film rights. I mean, standalones are kind of a whole new world every time. So yeah, I think if I had to do over again, I would probably focus less on series and do more standalone novels.
Speaking of film rights, is there anything that's been option that's been in development for you?
We we've come close on multiple projects. We had Stride sold to one of the streaming services a few years ago. Had the script all written down to a go no go, and they just decided not to go forward. And then Infinite, Infinite's probably my most unusual thriller. As I say, it very very close to sci-fi. I love the book. It's really an interesting novel. Universal picked up the option of the rights to Infinite. They re-optioned the rights to Infinite. We went through 2 versions of the screenplay. We had a great screenwriter behind it. And then, of course, the actors and writers strike hit last year. And unfortunately, I think so many of the projects that were in production during the strike, I think the momentum just got killed by the strike, and I think they have kind of short attention spans out in Hollywood. So will they be able to revive it? I'm not sure. That's disappointing because we had a lot of momentum. We had a great producer behind it, but I think it's been kind of dead in the ground since the strikes.
Is screenwriting anything that you've tried or that you're interested in?
I've been working with a screenwriter buddy of mine out in LA, and we've actually got a new pilot done for Stride that we've been shopping around. I think it's a great pilot. My heart is really not in screenwriting. I prefer utilizing kind of all 5 or 6 senses the way you can do it in novels. But at the same time, I love writing diverse novels and taking on new challenges. So I certainly wouldn't mind, kind of, trying to figure something out because for me, it's just I always just love taking on new projects and not knowing what's coming down the pike next.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. Well, we could keep talking forever, but I don't want to keep any more of your time. The author is Brian Freeman. The most recent book is Break Every Rule, his 30th novel in coming up in 20-year career, and he is not slowing down. So, Brian, thank you so much for hanging out, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Thank you.